Good evening and welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, and also welcome to everybody who's joining us on our live stream on YouTube. We are very pleased tonight to have with us Michael O'Loughlin. He is an award-winning journalist. He's currently a national correspondent for America Media. Some of you are familiar with America Magazine, the Jesuit journal. Michael writes for them. He's also the host of a podcast, The Untold Stories of AIDS in the Catholic Church, which is, not at all coincidentally, what his book is about that we'll be discussing this evening. His book is Hidden Mercy, AIDS, Catholics, and the Untold Stories of Compassion in the Face of Fear. His work really dovetails very nicely with the presentation we had 2 weeks ago from Brian Flanagan, a theologian who was talking about reconciling sin and sanctity in the church and how those things always seem to be in tension and together. As we talk with Michael about his research and the history that he's written of the various stories of how the church responded to the AIDS crisis in the 80s and 90s, I think we'll see both of those things happening throughout that history. So Michael, welcome very much. Good to have you with us. Yeah, it's ordinarily we do kind of a lecture format, but this is kind of a refreshing change to be able to do an interview.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for agreeing to my demands that we have an interview instead. I appreciate it. And I really hope that it's a good conversation that we have.
I think so. I think so. So just to kind of get us started off, tell us a little bit about yourself. Where did you grow up? What's kind of your early history?
Sure, yeah. I am a lifelong Catholic. I grew up in Massachusetts in a small town called Drake, sort of a suburban Catholic upbringing where the whole kind of town felt like it revolved around which parish you belonged to, and had a really wonderful experience. I went to St. Vincent College in New Hampshire, Benedictine school, studied theology there. I was saying at dinner I went to a public high school and had no idea that theology was even a thing that was studied, so it was real exciting when I got to college and learned this whole other area of how to explore our faith. So studied theology, went on to grad school, did a couple more years of theology, and then realized I did not want to be an academic. I didn't want to do a PhD and teach. So I had to figure out a way to use the religion training I had, and I loved writing, so I became a religion journalist, which is what I've been doing for the past 12 years or so.
Very good. Just to kind of set the stage, I mean, looking at our audience tonight, I suspect that there are more than a few of us that were around in the 1980s and 90s and remember what the atmosphere was like. But as HIV and AIDS began to emerge, what was kind of the cultural context that influenced all of this history that we'll be exploring?
Sure, yeah, it was kind of amazing. As I was here for Mass and then at dinner, I had a chance to chat with a few people. All of whom have this incredible first-hand experience of this time in the history of the 1980s and 90s. So it's a little intimidating sometimes to be up here talking when I know there's people in the audience who know this history much better than I do because they lived through it. So I hope it really is a back and forth where we can kind of hear some of your stories and I can tell you what I learned as well. Obviously, I don't remember that time firsthand. I was born in 1985. So by the time I'm kind of remembering things, sort of the peak of HIV and AIDS in the US, it's considered to be about 1996 or so I don't remember any of that history firsthand. And maybe I'll just explain a little bit why I was even interested in it. So, as I said, I've been a reporter for a number of years. I began reporting full-time back in 2014 or so. And my job is to cover the Catholic Church in the United States. So that means the institution, but also like what the church is doing in the public square. What are Catholic leaders up to? What are they saying about political issues, current events? And at the time, a big part of my beat was covering what the church was saying about the debates over same-sex marriage. That's what was happening kind of in the public square at the time. And it was interesting, there was always a lot to write about. Their bishops were saying things, Catholics in the pews had opinions, there were polls. And I was personally drawn to it because I'm a gay Catholic myself, and I was curious at the time, like, do I have a place in this institution, which isn't always welcoming to the LGBT community. So I was happy to be writing these stories, but it wasn't answering these kind of deep questions I had about my own faith and my own background and whether I should stay in this institution or not. And I remember I was talking to a priest friend one night, we were having dinner, and I was sort of unloading all this on him, saying how I didn't feel like I had a place in the church, and it was very difficult for me to reconcile my faith, my sexual orientation. And I said I felt like I was the first person ever to go through this, ever to have these kinds of questions. And he sort of nodded politely, but I think like rolled his eyes a little bit in his head, because of course I was not the first person to go through this, trying to figure out how to reconcile my identity with the church. And he told me a quick story about when he was a young priest back in the 1990s. He was on a college campus in Toronto, and he began hearing that HIV, which was still not very understood well at the time, that it was beginning to affect the campus community. So some students, faculty, staff, and there was a small group that wanted to meet and sort of be with each other and share their stories and support one another, and they couldn't find a place on campus to do that. So he had a place, probably something like this, kind of a church and some meeting rooms, and he said, well, why don't you use one of these rooms and your group can meet? So they did, and it was, they met for several weeks and everything was going fine, but my friend, as a young priest, he got called in by his bishop who said, you need to get that group out of the church because it looks like the church is lending support to the gay community and we can't have it. So my friend, he was pretty savvy, he said, well, actually, what we're doing is a pro-life ministry. People are dying and we need to be there with them. And the bishop relented and the group got to keep meeting. And it was this very small story in some ways. All he did was offer a room. It wasn't a ministry of his, but it was a part of his ministry I hadn't known about. And he thought that if I explored this time in history a little bit more, there might be other examples of how the Catholic community responded, as you said, good and bad, but I focus on kind of good stories, of standing with the gay community during a very difficult time. So that's sort of how I got interested in it. But to answer your question, sort of the context, the cultural context of the time is very important. So many of you might remember that time, but there's a poll that sticks with me that I learned pretty early on in my research. It was a poll by the Pew Research Center that asked Americans if they thought HIV and AIDS might be a punishment from God for people leading an immoral lifestyle. So the fact that the question was asked at all means that it was a prevalent enough opinion that they wanted to find out how many people believe this. And 44% of respondents said yes, that HIV and AIDS might be a punishment from God for people leading an immoral lifestyle. So what we know about sociology, 4 in 10 Americans agreed with that, probably more did, but didn't want to admit it to a pollster. So it was a very stigmatizing time for people with HIV and AIDS, which at that time meant primarily gay men, IV drug users, very marginalized communities at the time. And unfortunately, you had some Catholic leaders who were contributing to that stigma. They were often fighting against civil rights bills that would have helped the gay community keep health insurance, keep jobs, keep apartments, perpetuating the idea that there was a moral component to this virus, that maybe some kind of immoral behavior would lead to people getting sick. And that's important to understand, that's in the book, but at the same time you had people, we'll get into some of the stories I'm sure, you had Catholics like my friend and many other people I met over the 5 years I researched the book, who responded with mercy and compassion, who didn't let that bigotry, shame, stigma get in the way of standing where they thought Jesus would be with this marginalized group of people who were suffering a horrific public health crisis.
Yeah, I always was kind of baffled by that particular attitude because the words of Jesus in the Gospels make it very clear that disease is not a punishment from God. Furthermore, their lifestyle is not a category in Catholic moral theology. That is not a thing. So suddenly it becomes a thing when there's a lifestyle that people don't like. And, you know, if God is punishing people for that lifestyle, God needs to be a little more consistent because in the 80s and 90s, AIDS and HIV were almost unheard of in the lesbian community. So it's just not consistent. And it's certainly not consistent with our Catholic faith. But it was sadly very common. And even in the midst of that kind of institutional pushback, the history that you cover in your book tells remarkable stories of courage and compassion from Catholics in the trenches, in a sense. And part of what I really appreciated about the book is that you kind of follow some of these people throughout their history. So, for example, tell us a little bit about Sister Carol.
Sure, yeah. So Sister Carol Baltashevitz. When I began the research, I really didn't know where to turn, and I decided to go up to Loyola University in Chicago, where I live, which just happened to have the archives of the National Catholic AIDS Network. I didn't know what that was at the time, but it sounded kind of what I was looking for, so I got all these boxes and I was going through all these notes, newspaper articles, meetings from minutes, and I came across this very small article from the Associated Press from 1987, and it just mentioned that these two Catholic nuns from Belleville, Illinois, which is kind of greater St. Louis, a very small city in southern Illinois, these two Catholic nuns had moved to Manhattan in 1987 because they wanted to learn about HIV and AIDS care, and that was the place to do it. And it was a very short article, that was kind of it. And I thought there has to be something more here. Like, these two small town nuns from southern Illinois are moving to New York to learn about HIV and AIDS. Well, why are they doing that? What did they learn? What did they do afterwards? So I was able to take that small article and track down Sister Carol. She had actually gone on to found an HIV and AIDS resource center in Belleville. And she had left years earlier, but I was able to get in touch with her. And I called her up one day, and I said, will you tell me about your experience? And she kind of laughed because no one had asked her about this in a long time. She had kind of literally packed away that part of her life and hadn't thought much about it lately. But I was right, which was great. There was this incredible story where Sister Carol and Sister Mary Ellen Brombach, they were hospital sisters of St. Francis. They ran, the order ran hospitals and clinics throughout the Midwest. And Sister Carol had been an ER and ICU nurse up at a hospital in Michigan, and she felt really burnt out. And she had just turned 40, and was trying to figure out like what she wanted to do with her life. So she thought she would maybe get a little bit of a break from the ER and the ICU, and she requested a transfer down to do home care nursing in this small city of Belleville. And it was much slower. It did feel like a break that she wanted was going to happen. But then she started to get assigned patients. Usually young men who had grown up in the area. They had moved out to New York, LA, San Francisco, gotten sick, and then needed to move home. They didn't have the support network they needed out in the cities. And she knew what it was. They were sick with HIV. Many of them were dying from AIDS-related complications. But she was really frustrated because she was used to solving medical crises as a nurse. That's what she was trained to do. But at that point, in the late 1980s, there wasn't much you could do medically. So she began to act as a social worker. She was simply present with people when many doctors refused to see patients with HIV. But it wasn't enough for her. Like, she thought that she should be able to do more. So she was having dinner one night with Sister Mary Ellen, who worked at the hospital doing pastoral care. And they began talking and realized they were both feeling the same thing, that they were encountering mostly young men with HIV and AIDS, and they didn't know how to respond. So they ended up connecting with a former colleague who had moved from New York, who was running St. Clair's Hospital, a Catholic hospital right in the Hell's Kitchen that served a big population of people with HIV and AIDS. And they moved out there for 6 months. And it was kind of a crazy thing. Carol had never visited New York City, but she decided to move to New York in the 1980s, which I'm sure many of you know is not the New York of today. It was a very different place back then, but she stuck it out. She volunteered on the AIDS wards at St. Clair's and St. Vincent's. She attended trainings at the Gay Men's Health Crisis. She answered phone calls on an AIDS hotline at the Gay Men's Health Crisis, which to me was just this amazing thing where you had people calling in from across the country who needed help understanding HIV and how to protect themselves. So they would call in not knowing that there was a Catholic nun on the other end of the line, asking explicit questions that they needed information about public health and safety. And Carol tells me the story where people would call in and ask if certain things were safer than other things. And she had this big binder she'd be flipping through trying to find the answers. She'd have to put people on hold and yell at her colleagues. But it was frustrating for her. It was such a culture clash between what she described as being kind of a conservative Midwestern nun and then being in the middle of gay New York in the 1980s during HIV and AIDS. But she was tempted to give up, but didn't, and then moves home and opens what becomes eventually the largest HIV and AIDS resource center in that part of the country. So again, this real call of the gospel that she responded to by saying, this is where Jesus would be, I don't know what I'm doing, but I have the humility to step back and ask other people to help me, and it becomes a real advocate.
There's a certain irony in Sister's feeling all burned out, so what she needs to do next is get into HIV and AIDS ministry in New York. Yeah.
It wasn't the break she thought she was going to have.
No, but it was courageous. You know, it was a direct response to the call of the gospel to serve the people that were most in need. And she knew that she needed to know more and find out what this is and how this happens. And they went after it.
And I asked Sister Carol, Sister Mary Ellen unfortunately had passed away a few years before I began the project, so I have half the story, Sister Carol's story. But I asked her, I said, what made you do this? And she said, well, you know, if you confronted what I saw, you would do the same thing. And I said, I probably wouldn't have. Most people didn't. Most people did nothing. Like, what was it about what you saw that made you do this? And she thought for a minute and went back to the gospel and said, well, I know that that's where Jesus would have been. He would have been with this community that didn't have many allies, that was marginalized by the political world, by society. That's where Jesus would be, and that's where she wanted to put herself. And it was this, I think, dramatic example of someone living out the gospel against that very strong societal stigma against this community. She said, no, that's where I was called to go.
Yeah. And there was pushback.
There was pushback. Everyone I interviewed for the book faced some kind of pushback in one way or another. Sister Carol was interesting. With her being a member of a religious order, she was able to get the kind of support she needed. There was something about, I'm not just sucking up to you because you're a member of a religious order, but there was something about religious orders that they had more freedom, I think, to respond to a community that other, I think, priests and maybe lay Catholics didn't feel comfortable being around. It was something that there was a posture of humility, of listening to a community in need before acting, that something about religious communities prompted people to have that freedom in ways that other people did not.
And that's how religious orders have functioned throughout the history of the church. If there is something that needs to be done, and for whatever reason, the diocesan and clerical structures of the church can't or won't respond to that, it's always been the religious orders that have stepped in to do those things. And this was a great example of that. Yeah. And another person in your book that was fascinating to me was Father Bill, the artist. Say something about him.
Yeah, so Father Bill McNichols, William Hart McNichols, today he's known as an iconographer. He has a studio out in New Mexico where he lives, but back then in the early 1980s, he had just moved to New York to study art at the Pratt Institute. He wanted to use his artistic skills to help evangelize. He actually wanted to illustrate children's books, which is what brought him to New York City. But pretty quickly, he learned that there was this big need for pastoral care providers for people with HIV and AIDS. It was this good insight I think he had very early on that I think a lot of people take for granted that you don't have to think about end-of-life issues until you're in your 60s, 70s, 80s. All of a sudden you had this group of young men in their 20s, 30s, 40s who were facing end-of-life questions, who were struck with illness, who were dying pretty quickly after they became sick. And they were cut off from a resource a lot of people take for granted, faith communities. In many, especially if you were Catholic, you weren't really welcome in your faith community because of your sexual orientation, because of your illness. So you're left dealing with these questions about life and death, and you don't have the spiritual resources that many people do have at the end of their life. And Father Bill recognized that pretty quickly and helped develop an HIV and AIDS ministry focused around pastoral care. So he worked on the AIDS wards at St. Vincent's and St. Clair's, where Sister Carol was. He spent a lot of time in people's homes. He connected with a group called Dignity, which existed for gay, lesbian Catholics, started in the 60s, was really very vibrant in the 1980s. Connected with Dignity in New York, visited people in their homes. He was simply there, and he's, like many people I interviewed, he's very humble about the work that he did, but being present with people who felt like they were not welcome in their churches, in many instances had been disconnected from their families, even their friends at the time. There was so much fear around the virus that they lost their friend groups, and in many instances they felt completely abandoned, but Bill would show up and spend time with them in their final weeks and days. And he really helped bring attention to the plight that the gay Catholic community at the time was facing. He was one of a handful of priests who were openly gay at the time. He actually came out in a letter to the New York Times, which I don't know how his Jesuit superiors allowed that to happen, but it did, and he became a strong ally, kind of forcing the church, I think, to look at how it was treating its own members in a not always very Christian way. And through his HIV and AIDS activism and his art as well, called attention to the challenges facing the gay Catholic community at the time.
Now, at the same time as the community in New York and in other places around the country, virtually every big urban area was dealing with the HIV/AIDS crisis. The church was busily producing all kinds of documents that lots and lots of people in those communities found very difficult to understand and accept. That used language that they found very hurtful. What do you think was behind that particular kind of pushback? I mean, admittedly, for most people, you know, church is local and it's how their parish is treating them and how those things are going. But when the highest levels of the church are producing really challenging documents that are directly affecting people's lives, that was really tough for a lot of people.
Yeah, and I mean, what you're referring to is something that I'm like embarrassed now that I didn't put it together until I was researching the book. But so in 1986, the Vatican comes out with this document about homosexuality that contains some of the language we still hear today about intrinsically disordered, sort of language condemning homosexuality. And I'd always known about that document just because of who I am and the work that I've been doing. What I hadn't really done, though, was realize it came out in 1986 and what that meant. So you have HIV and AIDS really taking a devastating toll on the gay community. And at the same time, the Vatican hasn't said anything about HIV and AIDS at this point, which is also shocking. It had been around for 5 or 6 years at that point. And then you have this response coming down from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, condemning homosexuality in very clear terms. And it was shocking to me that that was the document coming from the Vatican at this very difficult and challenging time for the gay community. And I hadn't kind of put that all together until I was researching this book. And I found out it was partly because the gay and lesbian Catholic community in the 60s and 70s and early 80s was really starting to assert itself more prominently, kind of demanding to be treated with equality in the church. There was actually a little bit of movement toward that happening. There was a group of theologians who were pushing the church to maybe expand its understanding of human sexuality, to respond to scientific trends, and there seemed to be an openness to it following the Second Vatican Council that maybe there was something the church could learn from the community about human sexuality. Well, by 1986, that spirit was effectively being kind of quashed by the Vatican, and they wanted to make it clear about the church's moral teaching was not going to change. So that's when this document came out. But it led to a lot of hurt. Dignity, the group I mentioned earlier, Dignity was kicked out of churches across the country. So Father Bill, I found this great video archive footage of him leading this procession out of St. Francis Xavier Church in Chelsea, a Jesuit parish with a large gay community, their final mass there. So this document had real-world implications where you had a community under siege from HIV. Some of them found refuge in various parishes that were welcoming to the community, and then all of a sudden they were being forced out of there as well. So one gay Catholic long-term HIV survivor told me it felt like he was being kicked out of his spiritual home. It felt abusive to him in some ways because he was a lifelong Catholic and found refuge in the church after his partner died from AIDS, and then just a couple years later he was kicked out of his church because of this document in Rome. So again, the book, because of I think who I am, focuses much more on Sister Carol and Father Bill and sort of the good stories that were happening, but they are the exception. Sort of the more negative backdrop is what was happening in the wider church, and then folks like Carol and Bill were somehow able to find the courage and the strength to do this kind of ministry.
I was very surprised by the chapter that you wrote about the responses, I know it's multiple responses, from the Catholic worker community.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, say something about that. How did that shake out?
Yeah, I was also surprised by this. I'm sure most of you here know who Dorothy Day is, but yeah, I see a lot of nodding. So if you don't, real quick, founded the Catholic Worker Movement, which created houses of hospitality in New York and then around the country, radically standing in solidarity with the poor, running soup kitchens, what are effectively shelters, selling newspapers, bringing attention to the plight of the working class. Sort of like today, I think not officially a saint, but a saint for a certain kind of Catholic who's drawn to social justice movement, right? So in my mind, I thought, okay, like the Catholic worker's been around since the 30s, I think, right? So they were definitely around in the 80s and 90s, so I wondered what their response to HIV and AIDS was, because they're so radically oriented towards standing with marginalized communities. So I expected there to be some really great stories about Catholic worker houses doing some amazing work when it came to HIV and AIDS. But it was more complicated than that, I found out. Dorothy herself had embraced the totality of church teaching. So in addition to standing with the poor, she also embraced the church's moral teaching on sexuality, and she was very uncomfortable with homosexuality. And some of that kind of trickled down into the communities, and as a result, disappointingly, the Catholic work communities in New York City actually didn't do much with HIV and AIDS. There was a discomfort, kind of like what I talked about earlier with my friend, this bishop, thinking if you work with this community, it might be like lending support to the gay community, and the church didn't want that. That's how some of the Catholic worker houses kind of viewed it as well in New York City, which was disappointing. But as I was doing the research, I actually learned about a couple of Catholic worker houses that didn't have as strong of ties to Dorothy as the New York ones, who did amazing work. So it was kind of a happy, I guess, twist in my research. So there was one in Chicago where I live, where a former Franciscan friar, he and his then partner, they found an apartment building that would rent them 2 units, and they opened them up as a Catholic worker house for people with HIV to live, because there was this huge housing challenge for people with HIV, because landlords could deny you housing based on your medical status. So that happened in Chicago. I found a couple in Syracuse who did the same thing. They had met at Catholic work communities in Washington and Toronto. They met at a Peace March. They got together and they were moving to Syracuse, so they bought this big old Victorian house in a somewhat challenged neighborhood, and decided that they were going to do something. They wanted to do something in the Catholic worker world. They weren't sure what. And then they learned that people with HIV had a need for housing. So they opened up this house, they redid all the bedrooms, and brought in, over the course of 10 years, about 40 people who spent their final days living in this house, being taken care of by this couple. So it was, again, this amazing example of Catholics responding in very dramatic ways to what they were encountering with HIV and AIDS, and living out their faith in a really, what I found to be inspiring way.
Yeah, there's some advantages to being part of a movement that is decentralized and anarchic.
Yes, when I asked, their names are Michael and Nick, when I asked them, like, oh, what was the process like for establishing this Catholic worker house in Syracuse? They kind of just stared at me because they said, well, there's no process, you just do it. And that's what they did, they just did it. And it still exists today. The needs for people with HIV and AIDS have changed quite a bit, and they provide housing for undocumented immigrants today.
As challenging as the responses were that people made to the communities around them that were suffering terribly with HIV and AIDS, the other piece that was very moving to me was the response that the church made, or in some cases didn't make, for the cases of priests with HIV and AIDS. Say a little bit about that. What did you find?
Yeah, this was something that surprised me as well. And it was sort of an accident that I even stumbled onto this topic. Because so in the book, I write a lot about some of the folks I've already mentioned, and a lot of other individuals as well. But there's also sort of a thread of my own story, why I'm still part of the church, despite these challenges. And I write a little bit about this parish I go to in Chicago, which is a very welcoming and affirming place, probably much like this one. And I was curious, like, what was the history of that? Like, why is it like this? Why is it so welcoming to the LGBT community, yet fully integrated, and seems to be a place where all sorts of people who maybe don't fit in other parishes have found refuge in this place. And I found out that there had been a pastor there in the late 80s and early 90s who really helped create this ethos in the parish. He wanted it to be a welcoming place. It was located near the gay neighborhood in Chicago, so we had a special outreach to that community as well. But then I found out that he had actually died from HIV complications in the 1990s and went public with his diagnosis at a time when that was very taboo to do, given the complexities of a priest taking vows of celibacy and acknowledging that he had HIV and the implications of that. He actually, at his funeral mass, asked his friend who would deliver the eulogy, the homily, at the funeral mass, if he would acknowledge how he had died, that he had contracted HIV and died from AIDS-related complications. And the archdiocese had asked his friend not to do that. They really didn't want to go public with this, and the friend honored this priest's friend's wishes and did go public with it. And it was very interesting. There's two big newspapers in Chicago, the Sun-Times and the Tribune. They both carried obituaries of this priest who had died, but only one mentioned that he had died from HIV, the other one ignored his cause of death. So there was still clearly like this taboo around this. So as I learned that story, I began to look into it more and learned that there was a higher than the general population. The priesthood was affected by HIV at rates that was higher than the general population. And the church was very, in many ways, unwilling to acknowledge that. But in the book, I did find some instances of, like this priest of my parish, instances where priests did go public with this because they thought they could use the experience in order to help lessen the stigma of the wider community of people suffering with HIV. And there's a story in the book about a priest in Washington, D.C. who died from AIDS-related complications. And actually went public with it, and the bishop went public with it as well. He was influential in some ways and actually sent a letter to every bishop in the country saying that he had contracted HIV and that he was dying from AIDS, and imploring them to be more pastoral to the people with HIV and AIDS. So some good did come out of it, but it remained a taboo topic well into the 2000s. And I think even today there's still some hesitancy to deal with what actually happened.
And wasn't there a diocese that actually set up what was essentially a hospice house for priests with HIV and AIDS, and nobody came?
There was, yeah. So out in California, it was in some ways a forward-looking thing where a diocese said, let's create this house where we can get priests with HIV a place to live, first of all, but then also we can connect them to the medical care they need, to the psychological care they need. And they had this good plan, and different religious orders had funded it, and the diocese had contributed some money as well. But no one wanted to move in because there were so few priests who were willing to admit to their bishop, which they would have had to do to move to this house, that they had HIV. So it was good intentions, but the taboo around it, the stigma around HIV in the priesthood was so strong that ultimately it changed and became a Catholic worker house, actually, for people with HIV. So it lived out its mission, but just in a very different way because the shame and stigma of HIV in the priesthood was still so strong.
And I think it's important to remember that stigma wasn't just in the church. This was all through society. This was in the medical establishment. This was, in our politics. We were 5 or 6 years into the HIV/AIDS crisis before the President of the United States was able to say the word AIDS.
Yeah,
So this was our whole culture wrestling with this.
Yeah, it was. I'd always known that President Reagan didn't mention HIV or AIDS for a number of years. I was more surprised that Pope John Paul II didn't mention it until 1986, so 5 years into the crisis. And that was only because a reporter asked him on his way to San Francisco, and he was scheduled to meet with a child who had contracted HIV through a blood transfusion. So a reporter asked him about it, and that's when he finally broke the silence. So it was not just a church thing, but it was a church thing. Yeah. It was a societal kind of challenge, I think, this taboo around the topic.
What would you say are the kind of common elements or common traits that you saw in the histories of those people that had the courage to respond?
It's something I struggled with because I wasn't joking earlier when I said I don't know how I would respond if I was confronted with that. Because I'm sure there's issues today that we all know we could respond in better ways, but we don't. And that's not an indictment. I mean, we have lives to live, work, commitments. But there was something about how HIV was decimating a community that was so reviled, like as you said, by the political establishment, by the religious establishment. There was something, I think, that drew Carol, Bill, David Pace, he's the long-term HIV survivor I mentioned earlier, whose partner Bill had died from AIDS. Something drew them to action, and I did press them on this. But because they're so, many people I interviewed are so humble, like there's like a lack of introspection in a way, because they just said, no, you would have to respond and do that. Interestingly, so Carol was a member of the Franciscan order, so she cited St. Francis as an example, which there's some helpful parallels. He was helping people with leprosy back in the 13th century. So it was kind of easy to make the parallels. But Father Bill was a Jesuit, also cited St. Francis. So there was something about Franciscan spirituality. There was certainly the recognition that Jesus would be with this community. But what made them move from just feeling sympathy or empathy to taking action? I'm not sure what that was. Some kind of spark that the people I interviewed in the book had that most people did not.
Yeah, as I was reading the book, one of the things that occurred to me was that these were all people that were willing to step out of their comfort zone. A nun goes into a gay bar in New York. I mean, it sounds like the opening line for a not very good joke. Father Bill seeing a need and using his artistic talent and his spirituality, but taking him out of his comfort zone. He's not just an art student at craft.
No.
And in each of those cases, there was something, there was a willingness to step into something that in some ways was very alien. And to do that, not necessarily without fear, but still courageously.
Yeah, and I hope that point comes across, at least in the book, if it hasn't tonight. It wasn't easy for Carol to do this work. Like, it did come with risks. For Bill especially, I think the Jesuits at the time were uncomfortable with him being out as a gay priest and then doing this work with HIV. I think there was some discomfort there, and he received a little bit of pushback for that. So it wasn't easy. It's not like they just did this work and it was, an easy job for them. It was very uncomfortable at first. I mean, Sister Carol mentioned that one day she almost gave up on the whole project because it was after a shift on the hotline. She said she had enough to hear with sex, that she couldn't talk about it anymore, and she was like just very uncomfortable. And she almost gave up, but Sister Mary Ellen, who was a little bit older than she was, reminded her why they were there, and she ultimately stuck it out. So there were these moments that they had to overcome their own biases, their own prejudice. And Carol was actually, that was one of the lessons she took back most from her time in New York, was if you want to help a community in need, you have to examine what your own biases and prejudices are, put them aside, and then listen to the community about how you can be helpful. You can't just go in and try to be their savior. You have to learn from them at the same time. And that was true of many of the sisters I interviewed. So there's a chapter in the book about St. Vincent's Hospital in New York, which was sort of a hub of HIV and AIDS care right in Greenwich Village. And there was a group, the Sisters of Charity, that were in the hospital, and they made some missteps in the beginning. Like, now St. Vincent's is so closely associated with HIV and AIDS that it's kind of taken for granted that they did a great job. But early on, they were targeted by ACT-UP. They were accused of being insensitive. The medical staff, the security staff was kind of hostile, bigoted toward the gay community as they were there receiving medical care. And there was this protest by ACT-UP in the emergency room where they kind of desecrated the crucifix, and some hospital administrators wanted the sisters to press charges, and they could have. I mean, it was trespassing and vandalism, and it was a very in-your-face kind of protest. But the sisters said, no, like, this is a community that's hurting, obviously, and that's why they're acting out. Let's step back and figure out what's going on. So instead of reacting with threats of calling the police or barring people or kind of digging their heels in, they had a series of meetings over about 4 months and really listened to the community and said, well, how can we do better then? If it's not working, we want to serve you, we want to take care of you, offer you medical care, what can we do better? And they made some substantial changes, and eventually St. Vincent's did become a place very closely associated with HIV and AIDS care in New York. So there was this posture of humility and listening, I think, that was common to everyone I interviewed, that they didn't have all the answers, but they were willing to become uncomfortable and admit what they didn't know and then learn from the community so they could become good allies.
Yeah, I love the quotes from Sister Carol about before you move into a community to help them, you have to really be aware of your own biases and your own hang-ups and your own struggles. And it just struck me that that's true if you're working to help any particular community, whether you are working among the materially poor, whether you're working among immigrants, and that willingness to examine your own prejudices and biases and to kind of step outside of your own framework is what keeps you from being really kind of paternalistic and, let me tell you what you need, which of course the church is famous for. But it also helps those communities you're trying to reach out to feel like they've been seen. And in recent years, as Pope Francis has constantly reminded us about the importance of accompaniment. That's us going out to accompany them, not demanding that they come in and accompany us. And that's very challenging for a lot of people of faith, because it asks us to think, what are my biases? What's keeping me from doing this in a way that is healthy and integral to my faith, but also puts the needs of that other person first and really centers that.
Yeah, something I loved that Sister Carol was able to articulate in retrospect was it wasn't only that she went to New York and learned kind of the technical medical knowledge she needed or the administrative skills and then went back and opened this resource center. She said that her interaction with the gay community, and this wasn't planned, it actually broadened her understanding of God, because she saw love being lived out in ways that she hadn't experienced before, that she hadn't seen before. She traces it to an exact moment where she knew this young couple, one of whom was dying from AIDS and was in St. Clair's, I believe, and the other one was well and was visiting him every day. And she encountered the one who was not sick walking on the street one day. He was very upset, and he was crying and explained that his partner was dying, and he felt so powerless because there was nothing he could do to help. And she said she paused for what felt like a long time, but in reality was only a second, because she didn't know how to respond. She hadn't been trained in pastoral care for the LGBT community. That wasn't a thing in 1987. But she had this insight, okay, I can respond. I know how to respond when someone is upset that their husband or wife is dying, so I'll respond in the same way. That's what she did. She offered her shoulder and he cried, and she listened to what was upsetting him. And she said it was that moment that she realized love was bigger than she had understood previously. And she took that back to New York, back home to Belleville, and that kind of animated her ministry for the next decade or so. This interaction with the community she didn't know, she was open to learning, and it broadened her whole understanding of what it meant to be a Christian. I thought that was a powerful example that has helped me recognize when I need to step back and listen before I kind of make judgments on people.
Speaking of you, how has researching this history and documenting this, how has this changed and informed your faith?
It's been an incredibly powerful experience. So like I said, Sister Carol is one example of someone I call up and I say, I'm a reporter, can you spend an hour on the phone with me every month for the next 6 months telling me about your life, right? It's a big ask, but people are willing to do it, thankfully, because it led to the podcast and then the book. But for me, it's been very empowering, because I mentioned at the beginning this sense of isolation I felt, that I was the only person going through this, I was the only person struggling with the church. I sometimes joke that it's not easy for anyone to be Catholic. Your life will rub up against church teaching in some way at some point in your life. Everyone here knows that. It can be a challenge, and you have to make a commitment to stay and work through it, or you can leave. No one's forcing you to be here, but it's a challenge, and that's a good thing. For me, the challenge was isolation. I just didn't feel like there was a path for me to make life in the church work. But by learning this history, I've seen that there were generations of people who came before me who went through the same thing and they made it work. It's also helped me recognize that any space that is welcoming to the gay and lesbian community in the Catholic Church is not by accident. Sometimes it's taken for granted, like, there's a liberal parish here, or it's somewhere in the heart of the city, like there's somewhere that's welcoming to the gay community. It's just kind of like that's the way it is, right? But I learned that there's actually people fighting for that it wasn't always easy, that people put a lot on the line to make those spaces welcoming. So in addition to kind of making me feel more welcome by learning the history, it's been a good reminder that it takes a commitment from the next generation to keep those spaces going, because I think it's a pretty fragile thing. Otherwise, they might not be around when another young person comes along and needs them. So it's been edifying and also challenging, I think.
Well, and that's an important lesson, because there's a constantly shifting focus about who's not welcome today. And I think we've got to be attentive to that. Now, part of the local history of this parish is that there was an AIDS care team here that was formed during the midst of this crisis. And to talk about that a little bit, I'm going to ask Ed and Kathy Spain to come forward, and we're going to chat with them about that a little bit. So to start off with, there are some of our long-term parishioners here who probably have some memories of this, but there are also people that are fairly recent newcomers, like, I don't know, me. So first of all, how did that care team come about? What was the origin of that?
Well, let me, if I could start.
Sure.
The Catholic Church in the Albany Diocese didn't have its own program, but Bishop Hubbard was encouraging parishes to get involved with the VNA, the Visiting Nurses Association, throughout the Capital District. And they had gotten a grant from the Robert Woods Johnson Foundation to start this program, and it was AIDS care teams. And they looked to the churches, all of the churches in the Capital District, to provide, to offer opportunities for people to get involved. That was in the middle of the 90s. It was around 1995, 1996. At that point in time, there was some progress being made in terms of our attitudes about homosexuality. There was progress made with AIDS, and I think the church was warming up, and it did warm. This was a pretty open community here in the Albany Diocese, I think, by that time, and a lot of that was attributed to Bishop Hubbard. But how do we get involved?
Well, our youngest daughter, who was born in 1980, so we're certainly, was a junior at Catholic High. And there was a blurb in the bulletin here about the Eddy recruiting care teams. So Sarah said to us, she was the only one at home at that time. Everybody it was either in college or out working. And she asked us if we'd like to get involved in that. So we really did it because of Sarah. And there was a significant number of people from this parish who responded to that. There was an information night originally. And after that, some people decided it wasn't what they wanted to do. But we ended up with 9 people on our care team.
Who were they?
Oh, you want to know who they were? Well, there were the 3 of us. There was Vivian McNaughton, Susan Shippard, Marie Carroll, Peg Murtaugh, Karen Campbell, and Julie Stenkin, who was a professor in the chemistry department at the time, who has moved on, and I think that's it.
That's it.
So what kind of things did the care team do, and who were you working with?
Well, we worked with a young man, not young man, he was middle-aged, John.
We had to go to these training sessions in which they asked us about our attitudes, about everything, and we became a pretty cohesive group. It was interesting. And then they came and they announced to us who our care person was. And he was somebody that was local. And they said, well, you know, have a seat. One, he's gay. Secondly, he's black. And thirdly, he's got some mental health issues. and they looked at us, and I can remember, I think it was probably Susan Shippard, if you can remember Susan. She said, bring them on. And we had an 8-year relationship with a man. They in training, they would say that, you know, you're going to be dealing with somebody that's on his or her way out, you know. I mean, we're talking 6 months, a year and a half at the most. But John lived for 10 years. And we always thought that, you know, the socialization, you know, we weren't medical people. I mean, we offered John a helping hand. There was encouragement. There was so many things that he was a complicated guy. And part of that was his faith.
It was. John, you know, we'd ask him what he wanted to do. We didn't, certainly all as a group, entertain John or do things with John. We did it 1 or 2 persons at a time. When we got a little bit more, when he became more confident or trusting in us, the group wasn't a problem for him. But one of the things that he wanted to do was go to church. We tried a few, and he settled on Bethel Baptist Church, which is down on Fifth Avenue.
We even brought him here for quite a while, and he did admit, he said he was sort of spooked out by all the white people.
He was honest with us.
I feel the same way sometimes.
So we would take turns bringing John to Bethel Baptist Church. We would do things like bring him out for a meal. He had no family, and I think most of the care partners fell into that category. Some people did have folks locally, and others did not. He lived in a Hana house in Waterford, which you had to be clean, sober in order to stay at a Hana house, and they took care of his medical needs. And he had some ups and downs during that time.
And during that, as he was in decline, and it was, we're talking 2001, 2002, it became clear that he needed nursing home, skilled nursing services. And they told us, they looked around this area, and nobody would take John, mostly because of his mental health issues. We tried. We even advocated for that. To make a long story short, he ended up in a nursing home in Staten Island, New York. He had roots in New York City, but he ended up in Elizabeth Seton Nursing Home, nice Catholic nursing home for John the Baptist. And so we would go down there. We had to go down through New Jersey and then over the Goethals Bridge, if you know anything about Staten Island. And we would go down, we would try to see him at least a couple times a month, and we all took turns. The community here was very supporting. People were offering us, to bring things. People offered us money for gas, and, it wasn't really that, we really didn't suffer any financial sacrifices. But, here, we ended up burying him locally. When he died, we insisted that they bring him back here. The people in the Bethel Baptist Church offered to provide a funeral service. It was well attended by the people in that community. They loved him.
And they were right from the get-go. They welcomed John with open arms and us with open arms. John had a beautiful singing voice. So
if you've ever been to a black community church service, sometimes people will just stand up and just sing that old hallelujah. And John was just at home, and it was just beautiful. So, we're going over the time, Father. You should have cut us off.
It was a wonderful experience.
And we did our best to bring it home to the community. We would meet from time to time with the parish council. But everybody knew, and everybody asked, and everybody was very supportive, and it was as if we represented each of the people here and in the past. So it was a good experience, Kevin.
No, Kevin.
Well, thank you for sharing that history. Well, we have a few minutes left. So if you have questions or comments for Mike, this might be a good time to do that. Anybody's out there that has some thoughts or questions? Yes, Rosemary.
America is a Jesuit publication.
It is, yes.
How are things with the Jesuits?
Good, I think. They, at least in terms of my own reporting, they've been very supportive of this project. Yeah, I think things are good with the Jesuits. I've worked with them for 7 years now, and I've had a chance to travel to many Jesuit parishes and universities around the country, and sort of like the parish I mentioned in Chicago that attracts people who maybe wouldn't feel at home in other places, there's certainly that spirit in many of the Jesuit parishes I've visited too. So I'm hopeful. I have several young friends in their 20s who are who have joined the Jesuits and just starting out, so I think there's a bright future there. So yeah, I think things are good with the Jesuits. And not just because they pay me, but I think generally they're pretty good.
Joe?
AIDS is not over, as we all know. It's still afflicting people, primarily those that have other problems, poverty and such.
Yeah.
Do any of the ministries that you covered continue?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. I usually try to make a point of saying something similar at these talks. I just finished writing a story that will come out in a couple of months about efforts at different Catholic health systems to do HIV and AIDS outreach. And there's some. So every year in the United States, about 35,000 people are diagnosed with HIV. It's very different now today. It's chronic but manageable. Advances in pharmaceuticals means, as one doctor put it for the story I wrote, if you are able to stay on your medication, if you have access to it, you can take it. HIV will not determine when you die, something else will, some other kind of health condition will. So that's an amazing thing that was impossible to think about in the 80s. But yes, to your point, most of the ministries I wrote about no longer operate. So a lot of these Catholic ministries were started in the 80s and 90s and did amazing work. Like this sort of like buddy programs, what I call something like this, where people were assigned to help with meals, with laundry, getting people to appointments. Those were like really crucial. A lot of Catholic ministries did that kind of thing in the 80s and 90s. But today a lot of them have gone away. And I think there's a little bit of a challenge there. Why did they go away? I think some of it is what I just said, like you can manage HIV today, so there might not be a need for the same kinds of ministries that there were back then. But also it affects a different community now. It's primarily communities of color bear the brunt of HIV today, so that's one thing to keep in mind. Does that play a part in why many of the Catholic ministries no longer exist? I'm not sure. There's still, in some ways, a strong taboo against homosexuality in the Catholic Church that in some ways I think is maybe even stronger than it was in the 80s in a certain sense. So I think that could play a part in it. And then in some ways I think it's kind of paradoxical to what I said earlier about bishops, but I think there was more of an openness among bishops in the 80s to be partners with organizations that were fighting HIV, even if they didn't share the same views on, let's say, the role of condoms in preventing the spread of HIV. Today there seems to be more of a closing off mentality that the church does its own thing and doesn't partner with organizations, especially if they hold views that are contrary to church teaching. So I think there's a lot of different dynamics at work, but it is a good reminder and a good challenge. If the church isn't doing as much today as it did in the 80s and 90s, and it's still a crisis, well, why not? Maybe there is a challenge there for us to consider how we can respond in a more robust way today.
Thank you, Joe. Questions, thoughts? Somebody's pointing over here. Oh, yes, okay, Fran, thank you.
In your book, was you doing research about children that have AIDS and AIDS?
Yeah, it's a good question. So did I do any research about children, how children were affected by HIV and AIDS? The answer is not much, just to be frank. So because the through line of the book is sort of understanding the church's posture toward the LGBT community, I did focus primarily on how HIV and AIDS affected the gay community in the 80s and 90s.
Children that received AIDS, I was in elementary school, have to know, affected them quite severely.
Yeah, no, it was a big challenge, and I know, I mean, it didn't make it into the book, but there were a number of Catholic ministries that were founded that served primarily women and children with HIV. They did amazing work. It's just the book was limited to a certain number of words, and the stories didn't make it in. But yeah, it's an important part of the story.
But happily, the AIDS children, happily, when AZT came out, which was the first drug for treatment of AIDS, it was found very quickly that an infusion to a mother about to deliver would prevent the disease in almost 100%, not quite, but almost 100. Otherwise, the child had approximately a 60% chance of having AIDS if they were delivered without this. One of the things I always had difficulties with was that we did not make AZT compulsory for women who were giving birth. I don't know if you got into that at all, but it always upset me because when AZT came out, this was found, especially in New York State. I had a lot to do with this, but they didn't make it compulsory. They made it you told the woman that she could refuse. And unfortunately, and I'm going to say this, and it's going to sound cruel, but you're saying this to some of the stupidest people on earth, all right? And, I don't mean to be awful, but that is the truth. And they don't understand what you're saying. So we had children that were born that shouldn't have been born, and it's always, it's always been a problem. I treated the first AIDS patient in this area, and the first probably 300 of them.
Wow. Yeah, no, I didn't go into that in the book specifically, but yeah, I can imagine the frustration.
No, it's more of a medical issue than
Sure.
not. We were I found that we were very lucky in Albany County in the sense that I'm an infectious disease doctor, but we had actually very few doctors that refused to take care of AIDS patients. And I was especially, and I don't know whether it was just that period, but we had this group of older physicians who had been part of a military team during World War II. And they had seen all cross-sections of, in fact, they were part of the evacuation of Auschwitz, this particular team. It was all medical. And I think it was because they had seen so much when they were young doctors that when it came time to take care of this, it was just something they felt they had to do. I'm not saying there wasn't prejudice. Yes, there was, okay? But it was never acted on. And and I was very proud of them. I came across several that wouldn't take care of those patients. But quite frankly, professional pressure got to them eventually.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to amend my answer about ministry. So, I mean, there is the reality, too, that the Catholic Church is the largest provider of HIV and AIDS healthcare globally today, which is partly why I got interested in this. I was curious, like, how did that happen? And some of the history is in the book there. But so globally, like, it's actually not a bad picture. There's a lot of HIV and AIDS healthcare taking place, especially in several African countries. The church is the primary provider of HIV and AIDS care. So that's good. It's here in the United States where I don't think there's very robust HIV and AIDS outreach among Catholic healthcare.
Yeah, well, the book is Hidden Mercy, AIDS, Catholics, and the Untold Stories of Compassion in the Face of Fear. We don't have any copies here tonight, but It's available on Amazon and other places where you might think about buying books. I recommend it very highly. It's very readable, and it tells the history by telling individual people's stories in a way that's really compelling. And Mike has a great way of kind of weaving his own journey into the exploration of all that history in a way that is beautiful and exciting to read. So I recommend Hidden Mercy. If you're looking for something for the tail end of Lent or something to take you into the Easter season, I think this would be a good option. What I take from it primarily is really those stories of courage and hope. And that even in times when our institutions seem to be failing us or unwilling to step up, there are always courageous people who are willing to do the hard work and to go out of their comfort zone and to work to be Christ's compassion in the world. That gives me a great deal of hope. And so I'm really grateful to Mike for being with us and sharing some of this history with us tonight. And I think that's all we have for this evening. So thank you all for being with us. Just a reminder that next week, although we will not have a speaker, we will do Mass and dinner, and then we'll have a communal penance service afterwards. So work up some good sins.